This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I are talking about place names in your world building. We had a question from Steve. He wants to know if it's all right to base your setting on real world places and to use those place names and what some of the advantages and pitfalls of that can be. So who wants to start us off?
Well, I've definitely used a real person before, and is an astronaut, a famous astronaut, Colonel Chris Hadfield, appeared in one of my books towards the end, and I used him to sort of set some authenticity, but everything that I referred to was already in the public domain, and he was referred to positively. So it's my understanding that in terms of characters, if a person is in the public domain and you're not defaming them, then really you're going to have little issue with it. Clearly, if you're launching an attack on someone and they're a fictional character but using a real person in your book, then that's something that you would want to consult a legally trained professional about.
Right. But what about settings?
Settings. I think it's there's so much fiction out there that's using real settings that in a broad base. If it's a novel in London or New York or LA or Sydney or whatever, then that's, I think, perfectly acceptable and normal. The issue then comes down to believability. So if it only took someone 10 minutes to get across town, but locals know it takes an hour, then that's where you've got your issues there. And then when it comes to specifics, in Australia we have, for example, some areas that are famous touristically, and they've been branded, they've got trademarks. So if you're referring to them and you besmirch them, then you'd be in trouble. When it comes to more specifics, I think I'd be more inclined to create a fictional version of that, even if locals might recognize it and think, oh, I know where that is. That's that park, with that Colosseum built into it.
Yeah, and it is fun when you're writing in a real place to use that local hotspot that readers will recognize. And, it's kind of like having an inside joke built into your story. It's fun to go, oh, I know that place. I go there. But our goal is never to pull our reader out of our story. So then, I like to use a version of the real place, exercise my creative license and fictionalize it. And I'll change the name too, but I'll make it specific enough so that locals get it and can identify it, but they aren't going to be bothered, if I added a pool room onto the bar or something.
Yeah, I think that's the fun part about using real locations that you have then fictionalized is that you get a chance to make it fun for the reader. It's kind of like your own inside joke between the reader and the author, even if you're not talking about locals only, like even fictionalizing whole cities or landscapes or, continents, but you still leave enough in there that's recognizable under the surface that the reader gets a little kick out of it. Like, oh, I know what they're talking about. But the characters, of course, are oblivious. It's kind of a fun little insider, like Easter eggy type of thing.
Yes, definitely. Do you enjoy writing real world places into your settings?
Yeah, I think it's great. I had some great fun with it. The same story I was telling you about. I had a fictional town that was based on a real town that was 20 or 30 miles, 40k or so north of where I used to live in England. And that was a couple of hours from London. And at one point, the characters had to travel from there to get into Russia, to the only place these days where they launched to go to the International Space Station. And they used these Soyuz spacecraft. I knew nothing about that. I just had to use Dr. Google, and thank goodness we have Dr. Google these days. Yes. And it was fascinating to then say, okay, I then wanted to, so I've got to put this on a timeline. How many hours is it going to take them? And it's only a 6-hour flight from that particular base, rocket base, to the International Space Station. How interesting! So I think once you start grounding your mind in it. I mean, it's only like building a fantasy world anyway. You want to make sure that the believability stays there, and you don't want people to trip up on it. So yeah, I quite enjoyed that aspect of it. I thought it was it was you sort of the writer, and he goes, aha, I can do this, you know.
Yeah, and it's fun to take those real world facts, those things that that we have to deal with lest we be called out on them, and factor them into our plots and what are our characters doing now, because you have to either have the scene break, just execute the jump cut and ignore that chunk of time where they're traveling, or you have to account for it, and that can become quite a logistical concern when you're plotting your story, building in those real world things, not just don't pull the reader out by getting it wrong, but also, okay, my character must do X. It must take an hour to get across town because I'm basing it on a real place. So what does that look like in my story? How do I work with that piece?
Well, and I think that's where there's a line between keeping it in the real world and then fictionalizing your world. It's like, where is that line for your particular story? How true to real life do you want to be? How many real facts? Do you want your readers to be able to show up in that city and make that exact same walk as your character and recognize all of the landmarks? Or, is that too laborious for, for your story? So,
yeah, there's definitely that piece of it. And for me, the question is always, will doing this enhance my story and my reader's experience of the story? So in A Stone's Throw, there's a scene where the farmer's market sets up stalls along this pedestrian mall in downtown Minneapolis on Thursdays. So people come out of their offices at their lunch hours or when they get off work, and they do their farmer's market shopping and stuff. And I've got my characters walking down that mall and then ending up in Loring Park, a real place. So I had fun adding real world local color, and it was part of the characters meeting for the first time. So it was also plot centric, So if you can merge what you need to happen in your story with the fun you're having with your setting details, then it's most effective that way, and most fun too for you and the reader.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things there. When the story I was referring to, when I actually did use part of the journey, which was the descent on the government plane that they'd hired to take these two kids who were going to fly on the rocket. As you know, they weren't one of them. That's right. So I used the descent into there where they're coming in at night, because I'd worked out they'd be landing at night because of the time of day they left. So they see the lights of the space field, not space field, but the base. And in the main character, it's creating intense anxiety. Because she's about to face her biggest challenge. She's going to have to do something quite dangerous. She's going to have to go up into space. She's not at all excited about that. And the main sidekick, who's a boy her age, is a science geek. And he's staring out the window, and he's just like, oh, this is cool. This is really cool. But he's not going on the trip. So, and he's just so intensely jealous, because he's caught on one hand between, hating her for what she's doing, and then, looking out the window going, oh, this is amazing. So I think you can use your settings as well to amplify the character conflicts and make them even more believable as well. I mean, I don't know if I carried that off, but that was my intention.
Right.
And then the other thing I was thinking about is you can even I was Brandon Sanderson's Reckoners series, where the first book, Steelheart, actually takes place in Chicago, where the entire town has been turned to steel, and it's a superhero fantasy, and it's a superhero who did it, a malevolent superhero, so they have to fight. And he's got cities where there's one, I forget what city it is. Is it Atlanta or somewhere that turns into a city that can march across sand, so it moves. New York is almost completely underwater, so only the tips of the skyscrapers are livable. So it's really interesting, how he took real world settings that everyone would know, because they're iconic. And I mean, I knew from Australia a couple of the landmarks of Chicago, but presumably locals would have known a lot more. So there's that part. And I think Steve was asking specifically about, what you do, say, if you're using a high school, should you use the exact name? And, I think we did have some views about that when we were talking offline.
Yeah, we did. Well, I think it comes down to a question of accuracy and how accountable do you want to be to factual accuracy. So you could build your high school and your football team and their championship off of what actually happened and just change names. And if it's important to you to make readers aware of this, add an author's note. That's probably the easiest way to utilize your creative license and give yourself the freedom to go there. If you're writing a dramatization of real events, then you're going to want to be more accountable to facts, right? So, and that's more of a docudrama than a novel, if you're going in that direction. So I'm always in favor as a writer of changing place names just to, it's not that I don't want to be held accountable or I'm afraid of being called out. It's that I don't want my readers to jump back from the story. I mean, I was looking at directions, pulled up maps and looked at directions to Stillwater, and it has that little sidebar of information, and it said part of the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. And I was like, no, it is not. Are you crazy? Right? And that's the reaction you have as a reader.
As a reader, yeah.
If you hit one of those details, if I'd read that in a novel, I would have been like, have you ever been here? Come on. Yes. And so don't do that to your readers.
Right. It's that macro versus micro. We all are okay with the city being New York. But maybe we're not okay with the house being on this specific street, or the local bar being named, or the high school being the exact same name, because then the details start becoming very, very important. Whereas a reader's going to say, oh, New York, but what is this New York? They don't have the expectation that you're automatically going to be street for street, house for house, New York, when you say New York. But the second that you name something small, then the details become very, very important.
Yes. Yeah. And, we'll go to the business side of things briefly here and just say, if you do something like that pulls your readers out of the story, some of those readers might go review your book and say, she got it wrong. And then prospective readers see that and go, well, I don't want to read this book if she gets it wrong. If she's, you lose trust. Your readers say, oh, there goes your authority. I'll look for somebody else's book.
That's right. So don't name something inside of the metropolitan area if it's not, because you'll lose readers.
Just know that if you do name it, you're going to be accountable to factual details. And if it's something that is a landmark, like Loring Park, then you're going to, the insiders will enjoy seeing it depicted. If you're getting hyper specific about it, then you're kind of going into the danger zone again, unless you're really being accurate to it. It's dealing with verisimilitude and that feeling of truth versus documentary facts. That's their business. So just walk that line and know where the tipping point is.
Yeah, and you can you can refer to things if you're not going to have them appear. There's nothing wrong with saying, oh, that kid, didn't he come from, whatever, Winsford Smith High School, where that is a real name and a real place. Nothing wrong with doing that at all.
Right.
But if you're actually going to have lots of action taking place in Winsford Smith High School, then that's the point where you think, okay, is that really the correct thing to do unless I'm writing something that I really want to be very close to the truth? And if then I'm going to refer to the principal who was really a nasty piece of work, then you better fictionalize them because that's probably not advisable. So you definitely, I think Kathryn's right, macro to micro. And look at someone like Stephen King, who's based his entire career, well, not every work, but there's a lot of his work that's set very close to where he lives. Yet you will find, though, that some of the very specific towns are fictional. But they're usually based on an aggregation of a couple of very well-known places or places that readers have recognized and said, or even said, this is just like where I live, but it's clearly fictional. So, the guy's very clever at constructing the micro from the macro because he knows the macro very well.
Right. Yeah. And that's a perfect example of when write what you know is sage advice, because you're just drawing from your wellspring of knowledge and experience, so it's not about being narrow in what you can write, but it's about using the gifts of your experience to create places. And it's a lot of fun, I find, to take real settings and then transform them to layer over the real map of a place, my imagined town, or, whatever happens to be appropriate for that story.
And also there are writers I know who, or Joanna Penn would be one of them that's well known in the indie community, who love traveling to do research on exotic locations specifically so they can write them into books. And it's part of their passion. So I think that the write what you know can be fueled by your own passion too. If you have a passion for your locality, then by all means, or if you have a passion for, nature treks not far from you, then by all means use them. But don't let them be the driver of your craft. I think is well, okay, that's the wrong thing to say. It can be a darling, and as we all know, that can be a problem in getting a great story that's appealing to readers.
Yeah. How about when you're writing fantasy, Kathryn? Do you draw from known places?
It goes there through portals.
Yes, you leave the known home and walk through the wardrobe.
That's right, exactly. And then I just write what I see. No, I think, definitely. I love to use the skeleton frame of the known, because otherwise it's really a lot of work. Let's be honest. Like, world building is a lot of work. And I personally love the stories that are built on top of the reality, right? Because then it's just so much fun. And you get to twist things and make them how you imagine them or want them to be. But I think having that basis in reality is a really strong way to start your world building and then see what spins off from there. So
definitely. Yeah.
Yes.
Aria agrees.
Yes, Aria agrees. Well, on that note, I just want to remind everybody that if you're enjoying the show, please rate us, review us, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Also, join us at Storyworks Writers on Facebook. Share your thoughts, your comments, and keep us posted on how your writing is going in 2019. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.